This is not a story about fabric. This is a story about obsession, about a piece of fashion so powerful. It bent the necks of kings and queens, silenced voices at court, made nobles gasp for air, and transformed a single collar into a fortress of ego and artifice. It is the tale of the ruff, the collar so large it could extend shoulder to shoulder like a cartwheel, so stiff it required bone, steel, and starch to stay upright, so outrageous it demanded its own laws, and broke them anyway. In the world of Elizabethan England, what you wore did not merely say something about you. It decided what you could do, how far you could rise, and whether you had to lift a finger. In that age, a simple ruffle grew from the edge of a shirt into a monument around the neck, a theatrical, architectural, and utterly impractical display of privilege and pride. But it was not just fashion. The ruff was a weapon, and it choked an entire generation. In the beginning, the ruff was humble, a gentle frill at the neckline of a man's shirt. But like every vanity that goes unchecked, it began to grow, and with growth came symbolism. With symbolism came arms races, and with arms races came monstrosity. To wear a ruff was to say, I do not work, I do not bend, I do not eat with my hands. If your collar was too large for you to feed yourself, that was the point. You had servants to do that for you, and if it made it hard to move, or breathe, or turn your head, even better, it meant you didn't need to. You were above movement. You were above need. But fashion, this extreme, demands architecture. It demands structure, and in the year 1564, a woman named Dingen van der Plasse brought something to England that would change the fate of collars, forever transparent starch. With it, ruffs could be sculpted into vast, rigid halos. They could be folded, fluted, starched, and dried until they stood like the edge of a crown. And they did. One ruff could take 18 yards of linen. Some took 42. Yes, 42 yards. That is half a football field of folded fabric, wrapped around your neck, and people wore them with pride. But the ruff didn't just get bigger, it got political. Queen Elizabeth I, the woman who would come to define the era, wore ruffs that were so elaborate. She required thousands of pins to keep them fastened. She wasn't merely setting fashion, she was setting rules. Elizabeth banned blue ruffs, not for any reason but because she didn't like the colour. She issued laws about the size of collars. She ordered the Lord Mayor of London to crack down on what she called monstrous ruffs. One man, caught wearing an oversized collar after Easter, refused to comply. He appealed to his father-in-law, who happened to be one of the most powerful judges in the country, and he got away with it. The collars were growing, the rules were breaking, and even the Queen could not stop it. By the year 1580, ruffs had reached their peak. They spanned the entire width of the shoulders, supported by hidden wire and bone, worn not just by nobles, but by anyone desperate to look like one. They were made of lace, so fine it could fall apart in the rain. And sometimes, they did. In hot weather, they collapsed. In damp air, they wilted. Some were so fragile, they were worn only once. Others required such effort to maintain that they were passed between rooms like sacred relics. Not garments, but no matter the trouble, the ruff remained, because to not wear one was to fall. In time, things began to change. Around 1615, women started wearing falling ruffs, softer collars that draped like capes rather than standing tall like armor. Open front styles appeared, framing the face but freeing the neck. The age of suffocating fashion was slowly giving way to something else, something livable, something human. But the damage had been done for 70 years. England and much of Europe were ruled by a piece of linen. It was not the sword that drew blood in those decades. It was the starch. It was not the crown that weighed most heavily on a noble woman's head. It was the ruff, a status symbol that eventually collapsed under its own weight, disappearing as quietly as it had once risen. Tonight, we begin a story not just about lace and linen, not just about style and fabric. This is a story about how far people will go to appear untouchable, and what they lose when they forget how to bow their heads. This is the collar that devoured a kingdom. She had no memory of her first ruff. Only that one day, it was there stitched to the fabric of her life like a second spine, holding her upright before she even knew how to ask why she needed to stand so straight. She was born into a world where women were taught to carry themselves like portraits still, perfect, framed by lace. And she was told, from the time she could walk without a nursemaid's hand, that nothing should ever touch her neck but linen, starch, and expectation. In that world, bending your head too low was indecent. Showing your collarbone too plainly was careless. Moving too freely was dangerous. And so they built cages out of beauty. They tied bone and ribbon and polished wire beneath layers of lace, so fine it could shatter in the rain. They stitched her into her station, an heirloom body made to be displayed but never unwrapped. The ruff didn't just shape her posture, it shaped her silence. When your breath is pressed back into your chest, when your chin must remain high even in tears, you learn quickly that emotion has no place between folds. She learned the way other girls learned catechisms. 1 fold, 2 folds, 3 folds deep. The tighter the pleat, the better the family. The higher the collar, the stronger the bloodline. Her mother whispered secrets while starching lace in the fading candlelight, secrets about which baroness had worn closed ruffs to hide a pregnancy, which duchess had worn open ruffs to lure back a straying husband. A collar could accuse or beg or seduce, all without saying a word. And that, they said, was elegance. By the time she was 13, she could no longer sleep, lying flat. The collar had trained her muscles to stay stiff, to brace. Her dreams came in fragments, shadows of parlours and parlance, embroidery hoops, spinning like halos, fingers that brushed her shoulders only to be reprimanded. She had started wearing high lace in court appearances. Her neck too slender to balance the cartwheel styles, the queen favoured. But that didn't matter. It was not about comfort. It was never about comfort. It was about being seen. Herr Governess, a severe woman with trembling hands, taught her to keep her gaze forward at all times. The ruff is not just to wear, she would whisper through chapped lips. It is to remind you of who watches. She meant men. Of course, ambassadors, suitors, councilmen. But the girl began to wonder if it was also something older, something the walls remembered. Because the ruff, she realized, was never just about fashion. It was about surveillance. It forced the face upward. It made you impossible to ignore, and impossible to hide. In court, the air itself seemed made of starch. She watched women glide like ghosts, their collars parting the air with the authority of a crown. They couldn't turn fully to speak, so they learned to shift just their eyes. Whole conversations happened in glances. Jealousy was measured in millimeters. Her own ruff itched against her ears, the pins digging like thorns into her skin. But she smiled through it. That was the rule if it hurt. You wore it well. There were moments, brief, treasonous moments, when she longed to tear it off, to run barefoot through the hedges, to feel rain hit her collarbones, to eat without ceremony. But those were the thoughts of maids and milkmaids, not daughters of Parliament men. Instead, she practiced stillness. She practiced silence. She learned to weep without moving her mouth. Then came her first portrait. The painter arrived in a flurry of brushes and silence. He smelled of linseed and sweat, and he brought velvet curtains to drape behind her deep burgundy, to contrast the pale of her skin. He said nothing when she adjusted the ruff herself. making sure the folds were symmetrical, the lace unwrinkled. He began to paint her as if she were already dead serene, unbreathing, encased in thread. She held the pose for hours. Her back ached, her vision blurred. But when he stepped away to show her the canvas, she saw not pain, but power. The ruff was no longer a cage. It was a halo, a weapon, a throne of linen. She wore it more fiercely after that. By 17, she had 3 ruffs of her own. One with bone spokes to widen the spread, another with gold-threaded lace reserved for feast days, and a third, her favourite, stitched with tiny seed pearls. She had become fluent in their language. She knew what it meant when a woman wore a ruff low and soft. It meant she had no sons. When a man's collar was stiffened into sharp angles, it meant his house was in debt, but his pride was not. Every gathering was a battlefield of starched declarations, and she navigated them like a general. But the world began to change. A new generation of girls wore their collars open at the throat. They spoke of falling ruffs, of softness and ease. They laughed with their heads tilted forward, their voices unrestrained. She watched them with quiet alarm. Their necks were bare, their heads bowed freely. They did not seem to understand what had been given up, or what had once been required. She kept hers high. Even as the queen aged, and her court began to dissolve into new tastes and newer names, she remained loyal to the architecture that had raised her, not because it was fashionable, not even because it was beautiful, but because it was hers. It had held her like a promise when nothing else did. It had given her shape when the world threatened to blur her into a whisper. It had taught her to speak without sound, to endure without permission. And yet, sometimes, late at night, she would stand before her mirror, unpin the ruff stitch by stitch, and watch as her shoulders dropped. Her jaw loosened. Her breath deepened for the first time in hours. The woman in the mirror looked smaller, but more alive, as if for a moment, just a moment, she had remembered how to be human. But the next morning, she would lace it back on, because some women forget how to breathe without it. She did not arrive with a trumpet. There was no coronation, no sonnet written in her name, no royal marriage to bind her to history. She came by boat, by wind and trade, by the quiet passage of ideas between coasts. Her name was Dingen van der Plasse, a Dutch woman, born not into silk or scandal, but into the labour of laundry and fabric, of steam and soap, of starch and steadiness. And yet without title, without lineage, she altered the very silhouette of power in England. Not with a crown, but with a paste. England was stiff already, in manner and in hierarchy, in language and belief, but its collars sagged, its linen draped too gently. The ruffs, though noble, lacked architecture. They folded and fell too easily, especially in the damp air of London where ambition outpaced technique. The wealthy wanted their collars to float like halos, like declarations, like the edge of a throne. And so, as if history required her, Van der Plasse stepped ashore in the year 1564 and brought with her the alchemy of invisible strength. The starch she carried was unlike anything the English had seen. It did not cloud or crust. It left no trace of itself in the finished garment. It was clarity in chemical form, a stiffening agent that transformed fabric into geometry, into sculpture, into something that could defy gravity while whispering luxury. She didn't just sell the formula, she taught it to laundresses and linen workers, to noble women and their daughters. She opened her hands and offered them the secret, how to make linen rise like wings. The effect was immediate. What had once been simple, soft additions to the neckline now reached outward like fans, like radiating suns. Women began wearing ruffs so wide they could no longer walk through doorways without turning sideways. Men stood with their heads locked between two lattices of lace. their bodies straightened by the weight and balance of starch. Servants toiled for hours to keep them clean and structured. And in every drawing room and hall, people began to whisper not about the silk, nor the cut of a doublet, nor the hue of a cloak, but about the firmness of a ruff. How long it could hold, how tall it could stand, how sharp the pleats, how visible the expense. But none of this would have happened without her. She did not speak much in court. Some said her accent remained thick, her manners plain. She was not of noble blood. She never became a lady, but she trained ladies. Her name passed between the halls of Hardwicke and Hatfield, from duchesses to seamstresses to maids who carried pins in their aprons. Even Queen Elizabeth herself, famously obsessed with the perfection of her wardrobe, came to rely on the results of Van der Plas's innovation, though she may never have spoken her name aloud. It was strange. Then, how much power she had. Without lifting a sword or marrying a duke, she controlled the necks of England. She dictated the direction of faces in court upward, always upward. Her starch taught women to endure stillness, to stand like pillars. It taught men to wear their pride, not in action, but in angle. She turned collars into cages, lats into authority, clothing into ceremony. And though she never appeared in a royal portrait, her influence was in every one of them, in every ruffled circle that framed a royal chin, in every line of stiffened lace that caught the candlelight. And still, she remained a labourer. She worked with her hands. She mixed the starch in iron pots, sometimes over open flame. Her fingers were often burned. Her back ached from hours spent folding and pressing damp linen into sharp curves. When she slept, her dreams were filled with cloth unravelling, reforming, demanding shape. She did not dream of politics or praise, only the perfection of form. But history does not always reward the ones who shape it. In time, her name was forgotten. Starch became common. Other women took her place, and her technique spread so widely that it seemed always to have been there, like salt in water, like breath in lungs, as if England had always known how to make collars fly. And yet, there were whispers, in the private letters of ladies in waiting, in the hushed conversations of laundresses passing down the method, in the scribbled receipts for imported linen and starch. Her name sometimes flickered like a watermark. Van der Plas, mistress of linen, sculptor of pride, the woman who changed the posture of an empire. She never wrote a book. She left no memoir. But she altered the fabric of a century, not in metaphor, but in thread. And somewhere, maybe in a dusty drawer of some forgotten manor, or pressed beneath glass in a museum, no one visits. Often there still lies a collar starched by her own hands. It would be fragile now, brittle, yellowed with time, but if you held it gently and let the light fall just right, you would see the folds still hold. You would see the angles still reach for the sky, and you would know this is the shape she gave to power. She was not the first woman to wear a ruff, nor the last. But when Elizabeth Tudor wore one, the world noticed, and when she tired of a certain ruff, when its size offended her eye, when its shape displeased her taste, when its colour bruised her mood, she did not merely set it aside, she outlawed it. The Queen did not whisper in dressing rooms or scold courtiers behind closed doors. She ruled fashion the way she ruled her country, by decree, by spectacle, and when necessary, by fear. The ruff was no longer a garment. Unter herein, it became policy. She had watched it grow with interest at first, in her younger years, when her court was still assembling itself like a mosaic of new powers. She embraced the ruff's power to frame her face, to give her spine even more majesty. It became her signature, a sunburst of lace that flared behind her head in portrait after portrait. She would wear ruffs stiffened so high, so wide, so precise, that they made her appear untouchable, divine, even. Her enemies called her a vain woman. Her subjects called her a goddess. And yet, even gods have limits. As the years passed, the Ruffs grew wilder, as though the nobility were engaged in some silent battle to outdo the crown in absurdity. Lace turned to gold, ivory supports poked through sleeves, and whispers began to reach her ears, not about policy or treason, but about the collars her ladies were wearing. One had arrived at a mask with a ruff so enormous it brushed her ears. Another wore a double ruff, one layered atop another, rising like a wall around her neck. Elizabeth did not smile. She saw it not as flattery, but as encroachment, and in a court where power was measured in proximity. The width of a ruff could very well be the width of rebellion, so she did what only a queen could do. She banned them. She began with colours. Blue was the first to go. She had never liked it. It reminded her, perhaps, of her mother's coat, or of the bruises left behind by words never forgotten. Whatever the reason, Elizabeth declared all blue ruffs were henceforth forbidden by royal taste and by royal law. No one asked why. They simply obeyed. Then came the laws on size. She summoned Sir William Hewitt, the Lord Mayor of London, and gave him a new task, not to collect taxes, nor to enforce trade, but to reform, as she put it, these monstrous ruffs and other disorders. It was not a request. It was an order, and it came with teeth. Her Majesty's proclamation spread like smoke through the city. Tailors were warned. Lacemakers were watched. Those caught flaunting excessive collars in public were fined, and in some cases, arrested. One man, a certain Mr. Hewson, had dared to wear his oversized ruff after Easter, openly defying the Queen's decree. He was stopped, accused, threatened, but he did not back down. Instead, he summoned a greater power, his father-in-law, who happened to be the Lord Chief Baron, one of the highest judges in the land. And suddenly, the matter was no longer about fashion. It was about authority. The case passed through hands, through murmured chambers and parchment trails. The Queen's word had been challenged not by steel, but by starch, by lace, and in a world where image was power, even this could not be allowed. Elizabeth may not have hanged Mr. Hewson, but she never forgave. His name became a footnote in whispers, a warning to others. Do not let your collar rise above your queen's gaze. But even her decrees could not stop the rising tide of vanity. The nobility adapted. They altered their collars just enough to skirt the law, but not the meaning. They added wires instead of height. They widened rather than taulened. They began using translucent materials that could deceive the eye. A collar might technically meet the law's measurement, but in candlelight, it still flared like wings. The Queen watched. She adjusted. She issued new restrictions. And still, they disobeyed. Because by then, the ruff had become something more than fabric. It was resistance. It was ego made visible. To wear a large ruff was to say, I matter. 2. I will not shrink beneath your shadow. Elizabeth understood that language better than anyone. After all, she had spoken it first. And so, she continued to dress herself like an emblem. Her ruffs became more sculptural, more symbolic. They did not simply frame her, they fortified her. They rose like battlements around her face. A moat of lace between herself and the world. No man could touch her there. No ambassador could lean too close. No subject could mistake who ruled the room. She used fashion as the Romans used armor. Not to protect, but to conquer. But behind closed doors, in the solitude of her dressing chamber, the Queen sometimes stared at her own reflection at the lines deepening in her face, the tired weight beneath her eyes. The ruff made her seem immortal, but she was not. And each morning, as her ladies dressed her, as they pinned lace to her throat and powdered the stiff pleats white as bone, she felt the quiet press of age and loneliness. Her gowns grew heavier, her collars rose higher, and her smile, in portrait, became less soft and more severe. She had become the law. She had become the frame, and in doing so, she had written herself into history, not as a woman, but as a symbol, not as Elizabeth, but as the crown itself. The ruff had been her weapon, but it was also her mask. When William Hewitt was handed the chain of office, he believed it would be the weight of justice he'd be asked to bear. Taxes, treason, grain shortages. These were the usual burdens of the Lord Mayor of London. But in the year of our Queen, in a city boiling with lace and rivalry, it was not coin or crime that would test him. It was collars. He had expected to govern markets. Instead, he was asked to govern vanity. The order had arrived sealed in red wax. Heavy with authority, the monstrous ruffs must be curbed. Her Majesty's words, not putic, not gentle, sharp as scissors. The proclamation spoke of disorders, too of excess, of the corrupting spectacle of attire gone mad. It called on Sir William to restore propriety to the necklines of the realm, and though he would never say it aloud, he felt the quiet sting of absurdity. He, the Mayor of London, was now the enforcer of modest collars. But you did not laugh at the Queen's orders. You obeyed? He gathered his scribes, his bailiffs, his clerks with ink-stained hands and weary eyes. Together they wrote the new measurements: maximum allowable width, permitted height, acceptable levels of ornament, gold thread, barely, jewels, only in moderation, support wires hidden only, and no more than one ruff per neck. The era of doubles was over. They sent criers through the city, posted parchment decrees at every church door. Tailors were warned, dressmakers were summoned, seamstresses trembled, and the ruffs, for a moment, paused. But power, true power, never yields to paper. The nobles blinked, smiled, and adjusted, not their collars, but their strategies. They flattered the bailiffs. They bribed the clerks. They whispered promises in the ears of those who stitched and starched. Some even rewrote the laws themselves, with clever tailoring. A ruff, slightly tilted backward, gave the illusion of reduced size, even as it flared twice as wide. Others tucked gold beneath lace, jewels behind folds, and some, the boldest of them all, simply ignored the proclamation altogether. And that was when he appeared, Mr. Hewson. No man better embodied the quiet rebellion of fashion. He was not a noble, but he dressed like one. His ruffs were wide, stiff, impossibly symmetrical. His posture was that of a man who had never once bent not to labour, not to law. When he walked through the city, people turned, and when he wore his oversized ruff openly, brazenly, after Easter, he became a symbol. Sir William was furious. He summoned him, demanded compliance, quoted the Queen's own words. But Hewson stood firm, his chin high within the theatre of starch and lace, and replied not with apology but with lineage. His father-in-law, he explained with a pointed smile, was the Lord Chief Baron of the Exchequer, a man whose pen could move more than fashion, who sat just beneath the Queen herself in the architecture of law. Sir William hesitated. For how do you punish a man backed by the courts? How do you enforce taste upon someone whose connections outrank your decrees? You don't. You fold. And so Hewson's collar remained. Others saw. Others followed. It was not long before London became a tapestry of defiance. The streets were filled once again with collars that flared like wings, that rippled like sea foam, that reached out as if hungry for space and admiration. The proclamation was mocked, mimicked, and then simply forgotten. Tailors returned to their old habits. Lace orders increased. Gold thread was back in demand. Sir William kept trying. He hosted public inspections at gatherings. He ordered fines. He attempted raids on certain shops. But every attempt only pushed the collars higher, the lace more intricate, the resistance more beautiful. For every ruff he tried to contain, 5 more rose-like paper crowns from the shoulders of girls barely old enough to curtsy. What he didn't understand, what perhaps even the Queen had failed to grasp, was that this wasn't merely fashion. It was theatre. It was protest. It was a declaration, stitched not with thread but with hunger, hunger to be seen, to be envied, to belong to something exquisite, even if it crushed your throat. The ruffs had grown larger, not despite the law, but because of it, by trying to control them. The crown had made them matter more. Sir William's health declined. His patience wore thin, and at the end of his term, when he passed the chain to the next man, he did so with hands that trembled not from age, but from exhaustion. He had not defeated crime. He had not killed dis, and he had certainly not reduced the size of a single ruff. It retired quietly. No statue was carved for him. No song was sung. But somewhere, folded into the drawers of an old manor in the city, there still lies a letter with his name. A royal order, a memory of the day. A mayor was asked to control fashion, and failed. Because fashion, as it turns out, does not fear authority. It only becomes more powerful in its shadow. It was never just cloth. To the untrained eye, a ruff looked like a cloud, a soft ring of lace, hovering around the neck of the noble and the proud. But to those who had ever touched one, not merely worn, but built, they knew the truth. A ruff was a lie. A beautiful, rigid, breathless lie, made not of softness, but of structure. And underneath its delicate folds and angelic whiteness hid the unseen skeleton of an entire century's worth of pressure, pain, and performance. No ruff stood upright by lace alone. Inside each halo of pleats, there were wires invisible, deliberate, quietly cruel, thin, hand-forged hoops of tempered metal, bent by heat and hammer, sewn deep beneath layers of linen. Their purpose was simple: to hold the illusion together. They curved like ribs, like the cage of a corset, invisible to any admiring gaze, but unavoidable to the flesh. The wire pressed. It bit. It rubbed raw the back of necks and the nape of skulls, leaving thin, red rings beneath the powdered curls of both men and women. But no one spoke of that. They only spoke of form, of balance, of posture, of grace. And then there was bone. Some came from whalebone, others from carved ivory, wood, or even polished horn. These formed the fans thin, feather-light strips inserted into folds to give them weight and width. In many ruffs, each pleat was its own piece of architecture, carefully spaced with miniature bones that clicked and shifted as the wearer moved. A small gesture turning one's head. Reaching for a goblet could cause the entire collar to creak like a haunted staircase. But that sound, that faint clicking of bone against bone, that was the music of the court. It was a language spoken only by those who lived in the theatre of surfaces. A ruff was not merely worn, it was endured, and those who endured it well without complaint, without shifting, without the smallest twitch of discomfort, were believed to belong to power itself. For the ruff, you see, was not made for the body. It was made against it. It restricted movement. It narrowed breath. It forced the head upward. The jaw locked in place. Women learned to glance sideways from the corners of their eyes, to smile without lowering their chins, to whisper through lips held unnaturally high. Men drank with long-handled goblets, spoons extended like scepters. Dancers learned to float rather than turn. Lovers leaned forward cautiously, unsure where lace would end and skin might begin. And behind every wearer, there was a servant, Someone whose hands bled from pressing damp linen against hot irons. Someone who knew the secret folds. Who boiled starch into gel. Who tied and untied the dozens of invisible knots required to keep it all suspended. It took hours to dress in a ruff, and longer to dry it. A heavy rain could destroy it. A long journey could wrinkle it beyond repair. And yet still they wore them day after day, portrait after portrait. Because what it represented mattered more than what it inflicted. To wear ruff was to say, I do not need to move freely. I do not need comfort. I am important enough to sacrifice ease for awe. And in that way, the ruff became not just an object of fashion, but a tool of performance. It turned bodies into statues, people into icons, emotion into sculpture. But there were costs. By the late 1580s, medical complaints quietly emerged in the ledgers of court physicians. Women who suffered migraines from the weight of double-layered collars, men whose necks were inflamed by rusted wire, dancers who fainted from heat exhaustion during midsummer festivals while wearing collars stuffed with 18 yards of linen and bone, yet no one dared remove theirs. Not in public, not even in private, unless behind locked doors and shuttered mirrors. The ruff had become identity, and without it, one was naked. At night, in the solitude of unlit corridors and back rooms, maids would carefully unwind the drawstrings, slowly peel the starch-stiffened rings from reddened skin. The air would hit like freedom. Spines would sag, shoulders would tremble, and for a brief, silent moment, the wearer would become a person again, fragile, human, unframed. But come morning, it would return. The wire would slip beneath the linen once more. The bones would slide into place. The mask would lift, and another day of stillness would begin. Perhaps that is what made the ruff so powerful. It required pain. It demanded stillness. It fed off silence. It was not beauty that made it glorious, but discipline. To wear a ruff well, one had to master one's own body. One had to suppress instinct to duck, to twist, to breathe freely, and instead become a kind of statue, perfectly poised, eternally constrained. And for some, that was the very definition of nobility. But for others, for those who served, who built, who bled and bent to keep the collars standing, it was simply one more lie to launder, one more cage to clean, one more weight to carry, not on their own necks, but on their backs, the invisible wires, the fans of bone, the silent bruises. They left no marks on the portraits, but they were always there, hidden beneath the lace, hidden behind the glory, hidden in plain sight. It was a summer morning, too bright, too sharp, the kind of morning that reveals the flaws in lace, the cracks in bone, the lie in anything too carefully constructed. The court had gathered for a procession. There were trumpets, fluttering banners, horses shined to a mirror gloss, and among them, moving like a lily through a tide of lesser blooms, was a young woman whose name history no longer remembers. Though her collar would be remembered for centuries, her ruff was exquisite, wide as a serving platter, dense with lace, so fine it looked like breath caught in thread. It had taken 18 hours to starch, dry, and fold. It had been shaped over a frame of bone and brass, its structure hidden so delicately that the entire collar appeared to float, weightless, holy. She had not eaten since dawn. Her neck ached, her chest was stiff with effort, but she smiled, because on this day, all eyes were hers. And then, it rained. Not a storm, not thunder or lightning, just a soft, steady drizzle, the kind that begins as mist. En la suggestion, a warning no one heeded, because beauty was more important than sky. At first, she didn't notice. The ruff held, its fold still sharp, its lace still proud. She raised her chin higher, letting the droplets purl on her collar like blessings. But the starch had already begun to betray her. Slowly, silently, the linen began to absorb the rain. The bone warped. The wire trembled. The lace, once crisp as paper, began to sag like breath, exhaled too long, and then collapse. It happened in a whisper, not a crash. One pleat gave way, then another. The perfect ring of fabric curled inward like a dying petal. Gold thread bled into damp linen. Pine loosened. Her smile faltered. She reached up just once to steady it, forgetting what it meant to move with instinct. A gasp rippled through the crowd. By the time she reached the steps of the chapel, her ruff had folded in half, resting like a wilted flower against her shoulders. A servant rushed forward, cloak in hand, face tight with shame. But it was too late. She had been seen. The damage was not to the fabric. It was to the illusion. Because the ruff had promised perfection, immovability, a stillness that suggested something divine. And now it sagged, slumped, mortal, a reminder that even beauty made of lace and law can melt under water, that even the highest neck must eventually bow to weather. It was not the first ruff to collapse in the rain, nor the last. In the heat of summer, starch would soften from the warmth of the body itself. In winter, moisture gathered along breath and cloak and chill. The courtiers knew this. So did the tailors, the laundresses, the women who wept as they tried to dry ruined collars near open fires, praying the lace wouldn't scorch. Every ruff was a risk, a bet placed against weather, against wear, against the unpredictability of the world. But people kept wearing them, because the risk was worth it. To be seen as untouchable, if only for a moment. To glide through halls like a sculpture, to speak without needing to move. That was the power they craved. And when the collars failed, when the starch cracked, when the wire bent or the bones slipped, it was not fashion that was blamed. It was the wearer. They must have moved too quickly. They must have breathed too heavily. They must have let emotion interfere with posture. Shame followed collapse like shadow follows flame. There are paintings, even now, of noble women with ruffs, slightly askew. Portraits where the folds droop just barely at one edge. Historians call it age. They say the canvas has warped. The pigments weakened. But perhaps it wasn't the canvas. Perhaps it was the truth captured in oil, in shadow, in a moment where the collar didn't quite hold. There are no portraits of the aftermath. No images of women sitting in corners, shoulders bare, lace bunched like fallen leaves. No records of servants drying damp linen in the kitchens, hands blistered from irons, breath held as they tried to save something that cost more than their yearly wage. No memoirs of men who stood frozen as their collars sagged mid-speech, who paused in embarrassment, while laughter trickled down marble halls. But it happened. Often, and each time, the magic died a little more. The ruff promised permanence, but in truth, it was as temporary as breath, as fragile as pride. It could not survive rain. It could not survive heat. It could not survive life. And yet, they kept starching. They kept pinning. They kept believing, because the ruff was not worn for comfort. It was worn for delusion. The beautiful lie that one could rise above humanity. That lace could protect you from time. That stiffness could pass for strength. But the rain always came. And when it did, it didn't care how rich the wearer was, or how fine the linen, or how many hands had worked to build the cage. It simply touched what was never meant to be touched. And that was enough. It was a time when bodies were not supposed to exist. Not publicly. Not visibly, and certainly not freely. Every inch of flesh was governed, measured, dictated by fabric and rule. The ruff, more than any other garment, made the human form into a symbol, It framed the face, but erased the neck. It revealed the status, but denied the skin. And in a world obsessed with appearances, love had to find its way through the cracks in the lace. They called it the Court of Mirrors. Not because of reflection, but because everything you saw was twice removed. A smile was not just a smile, it was performance. A glance was not affection, it was calculation. And touch was almost impossible. The collars were too wide, the layers too thick, the consequences too great. But even so, they found ways. A nobleman once wrote, in a letter never meant to be read aloud, that he had fallen in love with the sound her ruff made when she turned her head. That soft creak of wire, that brush of lace against lace, it was the only thing she gave him. They had never spoken alone. They had never touched. But in the silence of a procession, she had glanced sideways, and the sound had reached him like a secret. Another courtier swore that a duchess kept a drawstring hidden behind her ear, so she could loosen her collar by a hair's breadth when she saw him. A signal, whispered, not through voice, but through linen. Their entire courtship occurred in gestures, how she bowed when she entered the gallery, whether her lace dipped left or right, how sharply she exhaled as she passed him. It was a choreography of denial. And still, it was real. The ruff made intimacy impossible, which meant that whatever survived through it, whatever passed between two people despite the obstruction, the stiffness, the scrutiny was powerful, more powerful than kisses, more lasting than touch. They met behind fans, behind folded letters, behind arrangements of lilies and lace. The ruff made it easy to pretend you were above desire, but it also made desire unbearable. It compressed the breath, quickened the pulse, flushed the cheeks while denying the body. Beneath the linen was longing, and sometimes longing, when trapped, grows more dangerous than lust ever could. There are stories never printed, only whispered of lovers who tore them off. Not publicly, never publicly, but in hidden rooms, under candlelight, in the last hour before dawn, collars unlaced by trembling hands, pins removed with reverence, each pleat unfolded as if undoing an oath. For those moments, the ruff was no longer a shield. It was a barrier they had survived, and when it finally dropped, it was not fabric that hit the floor. It was pretense. It was restraint. It was the rules of court. Undone, one fold at a time. They say one queen's lady-in-waiting fell in love with a French envoy, and that during a masked ball, they danced so closely, their ruffs brushed, and for the briefest moment, they knew they could never have more than that. The sound of two collars touching, a soft rustle, a shared, forbidden breath. In that era, a love letter could be sewn into the hem of a ruff. A single loose thread, pulled by the right hand, could mean yes. A dropped pin could mean no. They found language where language was forbidden. They made intimacy out of choreography, because the ruff forced them to. And yet, for all its constraint, for all its rigid cruelty, the ruff was also a container for secrets. Some women wore miniature portraits pinned inside the fold, visible only when dressing. Some men stitched initials into the linen, hidden by starch and shine. Some ruffs were passed between lovers not worn, but kept, folded in drawers, pressed into books, the linen still holding the shape of the other, the faint smell of rose water, of wax, of something human. Even years later, when fashion moved on and the great ruffs were folded into history, people remembered who they wore them for. The collar became a memory, a relic, a symbol not just of pain or pride, but of closeness never achieved. A whisper of a time when love had to pass through lace to survive. They could not hold hands. They could not kiss beneath open skies. They could not remove each other's burdens in daylight, but they could look across a hall, across a court, across a banquet table, and see a ruff, impossibly stiff, impossibly wide, and know that weight is for me. And sometimes that was enough. The palace is empty now, not in walls or windows, but in breath. The corridors no longer echo with the clicking of bone or the shuffle of heavy skirts. The starch has dried, the irons have cooled, the lace has yellowed, folded into drawers that haven't been opened in centuries. But if you walk there quietly, with intention, you might still feel it. The weight of something that refused to die, even when its wearers did, because the ruff never truly left. The crowns changed, the language softened, the fashions dissolved into new fabrics and freer shapes. But the ruff, that perfect ring of pride, silence, and spectacle left its outline on everything that followed. In the way we still sit straight when we feel watched, in the way we dress not for comfort, but to be seen, in the way we pretend to float, when all we want is to breathe. Some say history is measured in wars, but more often, it is measured in fabric. And the ruff was one of history's sharpest seams. It split the human form into two truths: who we were beneath the skin, and who we pretended to be above the collar. It told the world you did not labor, even when you suffered, that you did not sweat, even when you burned, that you did not bend not to need, nor grief, nor love. And in pretending, long enough, hard enough, you almost forgot how to bow your head. But time is gentle, even when it is cruel. There came a day, no one remembers exactly when the collars began to shrink. The wires were loosened. The starch was watered down. The bone, finally, was left in the box. The portraits grew softer. The lace, less rigid. It was not a revolution. There was no law, only a sigh. And then the ruff was gone, folded away, hung in museums, worn only by actors. Yesters, memories, a ghost of an era where the body was denied, and the soul was folded into pleats. But we still carry it, in the ways we hold ourselves, in the poses we strike, in the breath we forget to take before we speak. The ruff, though vanished, still speaks in the architecture of performance. It whispers from behind the glass of portraits. It creaks in the silence of museums. It hums in the pressure of image, still so loud in the world we live in. There is a ruff in every mask we wear, not made of linen, but of self. And so, tonight, as you lie down and close your eyes, think of the women who couldn't lean forward, the men who couldn't lower their heads, the lovers who touched only through lace, the servants whose hands cracked from hours of folding, the queens who turned silence into law, the tailors who stitched secrets into thread, the girls who learned to smile without moving. Think of the collars they wore not because they had to, but because the world told them they must. Think of the ones who survived it, and the ones who didn't. And then breathe. Let your head fall soft against the pillow. Let your spine rest. Let your throat go unbound. You do not need to be framed to be worthy. You do not need to be stiff to be seen. The world can wait for your performance. You are allowed to be real now. Sleep well. The ruff is gone, but you are still here.